think about the environments that light people up the most and that create the most motivation. And if we are going to sort of pick an ideal environment that does that, I would say it's a skateboard park. Like, kids go to a skateboard park and they get really, really good at skateboarding in a short amount of time. It is incredibly, incredibly motivating for certain kids. Why? Why? If we could teach algebra like kids learn to skateboard in a skateboard park, we'd be really, really good at algebra, right? Mm-hmm. But what are the ingredients of that environment, of that learning space? And the ingredients seem to be these vivid models of what you want to be. Not of like who you admire, but of the dude you want to become, mm-hmm. right? I don't just like admire that skateboarder. I want to do that trick and I want to be as cool as him, in every way. I want to be that guy. And so when that identity piece gets put into the equation, I think that lightning is a lot more likely to strike.
I'm Srini Rao, and this is the Unmistakable Creative Podcast, where you get a window into the stories and insights of the most innovative and creative minds who've started movements, built thriving businesses, written best-selling books, and created insanely interesting art. For more, check out our 500-episode archive at unmistakablecreative.com. Dan, welcome to the Unmistakable Creative. Thanks so much for taking the time to join us.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah, it is really cool to have you here. I came across your story by way of our mutual friend, Mike Rohde, who was a former guest here on the Unmistakable Creative, and I knew of your work, and so it's a real pleasure to have you here. For our listeners, can you tell us a bit about yourself, your story, your journey, your background, and how that has led you to this unique perspective that you have on talent?
It's funny. I guess you could sum it up in a quick word, which is Alaska. I'm a kid from Alaska. And that, growing up there, has its own sort of set of unique qualities, one of which is that you're sort of an outsider a lot of places. We was raised there, moved there when I was 3, was raised there since 1968. And so whenever we came to visit America, or the lower 48 as we called it, it kind of gave you a new way of looking at things and a new curiosity about things that people in the lower 48 sort of took for granted. How come things are this way? Why is this way? And I was fascinated by sports, by skill, by performance. And that has always kind of fueled me, along with having 2 brothers, each of which are less than a year away from me. So I grew up in a family of where everybody was sort of competing for stuff, and with that kind of outsider point of view, where I was sort of looking at performance and at people, sort of saying, "Oh, that's pretty interesting. How could I learn what they do? How could I understand it better?" Mm-hmm. And then after that, I ended up sort of going to school down here, and then ended up as a career. Was about to be a doctor. Was very close to becoming a doctor, and switched at the last minute into journalism. Particularly interested in science and interested in sports, and I ended up working at a really crazy magazine called Outside Magazine that covers all of that stuff. And did a series, started as a writer doing a series of stories that all kind of all magazine stories, all narratives end up revolving around like why somebody's really good. If you're writing about a politician, if you're writing about a musician, if you're writing about a skier, you're always revolving around those questions. And so I started seeing patterns in the responses, whether it was a backcountry skier or a politician or a musician or anything. And I got interested in exploring that more and more deeply, both in my own life and also in my work. And it sort of led me. One day I got this newspaper clip about back when there were newspaper clips. Do you remember those days? Mm-hmm. And it was about a tennis club called Spartak, which was in Moscow, and it had produced, I think, 5 times more top 20 women players than in the entire United States out of this one club. And I found out did a little more research and digging, found out that they had 1 indoor court. So basically this place with 1 indoor court was producing way more tennis champions than the entire United States. And I had to go there. And I started, that was my first visit to a talent hotbed. And I started, there are these places around the globe that are just like that in music and math and art and sports. And so I started visiting a series of those and looking at the patterns of behavior that connect them, looking at what they're doing on the ground and looking at what's motivating them and looking at how they're being taught. And so that was kind of the basis of my book, The Talent Code, that, normally when I guess it came out a few years ago, but the conversations that it started are still sort of happening. I guess that's why it brought us right to this moment.
You know, it's interesting. You know, I always wonder about people's childhood. You mentioned that the byproduct of growing up in Alaska was this different way of looking at things, this natural tendency to ask why, to question things. You think that that is something that can be learned and developed, this ability to question what appears to be the status quo? Or do you think some people are just inherently capable of it?
I think some people get a better platform to do that. It's just the way it is. Because of the environment, because of the difference in the environment from where they come and where they go. New York City is filled with those people.
Yeah.
Most people who succeed in New York are not born in New York. They're from Omaha, actually, most of them. And so they come there and they absolutely perceive things more deeply, try harder, don't take things for granted, upset the status quo. And there's sort of the classic outsider arc. And I think some of that is sort of irreplaceable. Are there ways to kind of make ourselves outsiders, to sort of jog those neurons and wake those up a little bit? I think there are. I think travel is a wonderful way to do that. Finding ways to kind of pull out of your daily routine, making a habit of giving yourself sort of the eyes of an outsider are useful. And pursuing a wide variety of skills is another way to do it. I came across a really crazy stat the other day that said that Nobel Prize winners are 22 times more likely to have an artistic habit, like to play the violin or to paint, than the rest of scientists, which is an incredible notion, that they're routinely sort of dipping themselves in these other domains and building this repertoire of connections. If creativity is connections, then immersing yourself in a variety of domains, on all of which you're sort of an outsider, I guess you could say, allow you to look back across domains and connect ideas across domains that fuel creativity. So I don't think it is necessarily a prerequisite to be an outsider, but it sure helps. A, and B, can we build sort of these outsider habits in our lives? And I think that Nobel Prize winning statistic would suggest that, yeah, you bet we can.
So when you look back at, childhood mentors, people, I mean, were there certain inflection points or moments that you think ultimately led you down this path of journalism and, studying success, prior to some of the ones that you've mentioned, like early on in your life, people, like mentors, influencers?
Huge. Yeah. I mean, one domain, they were, wonderful writers, books that you read and it just took the top of your head off. You couldn't believe it was real. Tom Wolfe, The Right Stuff, was that book for me. Reading that and knowing that someone had put it together and someone had the privilege, the story of the astronauts and the space program in the 60s and Chuck Yeager. And if anybody hasn't read it, I highly recommend it because it's amazing. But that sort of woke me up. And I was really fortunate. Anchorage, Alaska is a pretty diverse, interesting place. Nobody there is from there. Alaska is a place where people are either running away from something or running to something. So there's a lot of I was lucky enough to have a lot of great teachers. And a couple in particular stood out. One was a coach that I had who was this guy, Gordon Speidel. He was a baseball coach. He was really this quiet guy. I can't remember anything he ever told me. Like, I can't really recall any knowledge he imparted or anything, but I could remember sort of the way he made me feel and the way he made the team feel. And he was an incredibly successful coach. He was a milkman, actually. That was his daily job, as a milkman coach, and which gave his afternoons free to coach baseball. And he really stayed with me. It's like, wow, what was that all about? Like, here's this guy. He's really quiet. He's mild. He's, not sort of the image of a General Patton or a charismatic leader in any way, but he's having this profound effect on my learning, on the success of this team, on this little culture we're creating on a baseball field. How's he do that? He was always sort of this magical figure to me. So that kind of a teacher was really lucky to bump into, and I would say very formative.
That feeling of being awake from reading something like The Right Stuff. I've asked people this question in numerous forms. I'm curious why so many people miss that in their lives, because I kind of wonder if I ever found it. In some ways, I feel like I've ended up here very accidentally, getting to write books and do the things that I'm doing now. but I don't think I could pinpoint a moment like that in my life. And, given the perspective that you have, I'm curious why you think it's so overlooked.
Well, I don't think it always happens to everybody. I think, it's almost an ignition, right? And like any ignition, you need to have the right conditions for lightning to form. It won't always form, but when it does, when you've got sort of the right sort of environment. And I mean, one way to think about that question is think about the environments that light people up the most and that create the most motivation. And if we are going to sort of pick an ideal environment that does that, I would say it's a skateboard park. Like, kids go to a skateboard park and they get really, really good at skateboarding in a short amount of time. It is incredibly, incredibly motivating for certain kids. Why? Why? If we could teach algebra like kids learn to skateboard in a skateboard park, we'd be really, really good at algebra, right? Mm-hmm. But what are the ingredients of that environment, of that learning space? And the ingredients seem to be these vivid models of what you want to be. Not of like who you admire, but of the dude you want to become, mm-hmm. right? I don't just like admire that skateboarder. I want to do that trick and I want to be as cool as him, in every way. I want to be that guy. And so when that identity piece gets put into the equation, I think that lightning is a lot more likely to strike. And the other element that place has, of course, is tons of repetition and failure and struggle. Mm-hmm. You fall off the skateboard a lot when you're first starting out, and you don't have a coach sort of telling you what to do. You're figuring it out yourself. So there's a lot of ownership. So this feeling of like you're struggling on your own in a sort of a tough environment, but right around the edge of that environment is this enchanted circle of people who are awesome and who you want to be, and you want to join that circle. You just don't want to sort of get a little better or get good to please your parents or achieve some level of competency. You want to be somebody. And that to me is the ingredient where you find that moment where somebody says, oh my God. I mean, it's kind of funny. Last night, my wife and I went to see Bruce Springsteen. And I had never seen him before. And, I like his music. And she loves his music. She might love him a little too much. He's very lovable. And before the concert, I was reading this, great profile of him. And it started with this scene of young Bruce. It was this amazing story written by David Remnick in the New Yorker. And it has a scene of Bruce Springsteen in his kitchen. And he's like 10. And on the TV comes Elvis Presley. And he is like blown away. Now, Bruce is from kind of a dysfunctional home. He's got all kinds of issues with his dad. But he looks at Elvis and he goes to his mother. He says, that is who I want to be. Like, that's me. That is it for me. And you can actually connect the dots between like that incredible moment where this kid has that happen and, this concert that we saw last night, that lightning strikes. And if you keep that fuel tank filled and keep sort of struggling in the right ways, I mean, it's incredible what level of kind of competency and talent that can be built. But it all starts like, what if he had been on a different channel that night, or would that have happened anyway at some point? Maybe so, maybe it would have. But when you look at the way talent hotbeds grow, a lot of times you do have these igniting events. You have Anna Kournikova, a Russian tennis player who succeeds. And then the next year there's 3 good Russians. The next year there's 8 good Russians. The next year there's 12. And, you have Suri Pak, a great Korean golfer. And the next year you've got more and more and more and more and more. So this moment of putting someone in the windshield, we can think of it as that, staring at someone in your windshield who you connect with, who your identity connects with. That's incredibly powerful. And we can't, you might be able to seed the clouds a little bit, but it's hard to make that lightning strike.
That's interesting because that was actually going to be my next question. So this raises actually 2 questions for me, especially because you mentioned algebra and you compared it to skateboarding, which raises a question about education and what your perspective is on education, given what you know about talent and how it develops. And then the other one I think, which in some ways maybe you've answered, is can you create the conditions for lightning to strike? Or can you put yourself in the way of lightning striking?
Yeah, I think you can help. I think you can help things along. And one great example of helping things along is the way YouTube has affected the music world. Mm-hmm. When you talk to musicians across the board, classical, jazz, whatever, they will all point to the moment of YouTube as being this huge force where all of a sudden you've got kids who can stare at some solo or some other kid across the globe playing some song they want to play, and then watch them play it over and over, like in slow motion, and look at it and learn it and practice it, and really have this feeling of being able to fill your windshield with this person that you want to become, this solo that you want to build. And it's been a huge, injection, like almost like a steroid in terms of creating the overall level of talent that we see. So, yeah, I think the windshield is sort of a, you can paste and direct yourself in different ways. And I know in some kind of systemic ways, there was a situation I ran into recently. Some Green Berets. There was a troop that was having trouble they wanted their guys to become better communicators. So they sent them to hang out with the corner offices of General Electric and watched people give speeches and manage meetings and have tough conversations. And they just sort of filled their windshield with these brilliant communicators. And that really helped. They sort of could add a model in their head of how to communicate better, and were filled with these kind of hugely motivating examples of elite communicators. So yeah, I think it is a resource that I think can be messed with at the most basic Bruce Springsteen level. That's tough. It's rare. If that happens to you, way to go. If that happens to your kid, you should definitely notice it. Yeah. But the challenge, I think, to most sort of in our mundane lives that we live is more like, how do we keep renewing that, and how do we design our windshield a little bit so we're taking time to really stare at the people we want to stare at.
Yeah. I guess in a lot of ways, this podcast provides a windshield.
Yeah, totally. Right. Why do people tune in? I mean, that's the reason. I think it's one of the reasons, obviously. The brilliant conversation we're having, of course, being the other.
What about the education piece?
Yeah, I think it makes you look at education a different way. I mean, if we pull the camera back on education, this sort of factory model that we have now where kids go into a room and listen to someone talk for an hour and then go in another room and listen to someone else talk for an hour and take notes, is fairly recent. If we wanted to go back to the question of how did the Renaissance painters get to be so good, what we'd find is that they weren't taking classes on oil painting, and they weren't listening to someone talk about oil painting. They built up this tremendous skateboard park, basically, of where there were apprentices at a pretty young age who were not sort of learning theory, but who were actually grinding the pigments, actually harvesting the eggs for the different paints, and learning by copying. And each of them really had their windshield filled with a mentor. And the stakes were not just sort of to learn for learning's sake, but we got to get this contract done or we're going to lose this job. You had super urgent, high modeling, high repetition apprenticeships, which is when we all, if you reflect and if I reflect on moments in life where we really learned something, where we really improved, chances are we don't reflect back on some lecture we heard or some class we took. This class may have added to insight and helped us think about it, think about things in different ways. But if we're talking about adding skill, an apprenticeship, a mentor, those sorts of things, those sorts of learning ecosystems, if we can call them that, are 1,000 times more powerful. And the reason isn't sort of a theoretical reason. The reason is sort of literally what's happening in your brain in those situations. There's an MIT study recently where they wired up kids at a lecture, and it was sort of close to flatline. There wasn't much happening, right? You don't learn by listening. With all due respect to this podcast and all its listeners, you don't get better by listening. You get better by doing stuff and struggling at it and working toward a model of what you want to do, and filling your windshield with that model and putting in intense struggling effort over and over again. And there's been some really interesting efforts in education to sort of flip the classroom, which is really an interesting idea, which sort of, instead of listening to the lecture during class, they listen to it at home. Mm-hmm. Where they can rewind the lecture, get maximum understanding, watch it over and over again. And then when we get to class, they start doing the reps. They start either trying to, take apart the sentence or do the math problem. And then the teacher circulates and offers kind of pointed, individualized coaching to each kid as they struggle. So they're not struggling at home. They're struggling with the teacher, and they're able to learn faster as a result. So it's an exciting time in education, I think, in a lot of ways, but we're also kind of operating out of this model that is, frankly, isn't that great.
Yeah. So I don't know about you, but vacuuming is not one of those things that I ever look forward to doing. But as you know, your environment has a huge impact on your creativity. So I still like it to be clean wherever I'm living and working. But now it doesn't have to be something that you deal with. If you're like me and you grew up in the 80s, you probably fantasized about the day when cleaning your house would be like it was for the Jetsons, meaning you don't have to lift a finger. Well, the good news is that we're already kind of living in that future. And the easiest way to make sure your floors are cleaned every day is with the iRobot Roomba Robot Vacuum. It cleans up after itself. The Clean Base automatic dirt disposal takes convenience to a new level, automatically empties its own bin into an allergen lock bag that holds 60 days of debris and traps 99% of pollen, mold, and dust mites, so you can forget about vacuuming for months at a time. Let the Roomba clean for you instead. It learns your home, finds dirt, and empties itself on its own. It's got powerful cleaning performance made effortless. Remember, if it's not from iRobot, it's not a Roomba. To learn more, go to irobot.com/unmistakable. Well, I think that makes a perfect setup to talk about what I really want to spend the bulk of our time focusing on, which is this idea of the talent code and what drives world-class performance, the framework for it. And, I think the bigger question that is probably on everybody's mind is, how is it accessible to me?
Yeah, right. Well, I mean, it's interesting to think about it that way, because it's accessible. People are already sort of doing it. I think it's more a question of identifying it and seeing it clearly than it is providing some bit of news. Mm-hmm. Really, if we were to distill it into a sort of a quick phrase, it would be: struggle makes you smarter. Learning has a velocity. Learning has got learning is not all created equal. And there's a story that sort of brings us home that I tell in the pages of the book, and it starts with this girl named Clarissa, and she's part of this incredible study where they tracked her musical practice. She plays a clarinet. They track her musical practice for like 15 years. So for 15 years, they are videotaping her practice and seeing where she progresses the most, right? I mean, and so in the course of this one clip of tape, she plays two songs. And the first song she plays is the Blue Danube. And she plays it straight through. She makes a few mistakes. It's like, bum, ba, da, bum, 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 bum. And she makes a few mistakes. She plays it. And the guy who did the study, this guy, Gary McPherson, says, like, there's zero learning happening here. She's in this is very extremely shallow learning is going on. She's not attending to her mistakes. She's not feeling them. And then she plays another song. It's a very short jazz riff called The Golden Wedding. And it starts with like, ba-da-ba-ba-ba-ba-da-dum. And she plays it, and she plays a few notes, and she makes a mistake, and she feels that mistake. Like, you can almost, it's like electricity is being shot through the keys of the clarinet. Like, she almost drops it, and she feels that. She's like, ah. And then she takes the clarinet out of her mouth, and she looks at the notes and hums them. And then she fingers the keys slowly and then more quickly along with playing the right notes, but not actually blowing the notes. She's isolating each of the skills. She's keenly attending to when she makes a mistake and when she fixes it. She's feeling that mistake. And her learning velocity goes up 10 times during that 5 minutes. In 5 minutes, she accomplishes more learning than she would in a month of practicing the other way. So this slight change in effort and attention changes what's happening in her brain entirely. She starts to make new connections, and she starts to hone those connections to make them work better. And those mistakes, here's the kind of, thing to think about. Those mistakes that she's making when she plays the Golden Wedding aren't really mistakes. They are they're mileposts. They're tools she's using to get to the solution. If she didn't make the mistake, if she didn't pay attention to the mistake, she wouldn't know how to make the right move. So that struggle is literally making her smarter. That struggle, we typically interpret struggle as being a negative. It's embarrassing. It's difficult. It's painful to struggle on the edge of your ability. Now, notice that she's not struggling like way past her ability. She's not just like thrashing around hoping to hit one right note out of 10. She's on the edge. She's like getting 60, 70, 80% of the notes and feeling that 20 or 30% she's not making. That is what you call the sweet spot. And that's where learning happens. And it's funny they call it the sweet spot because it feels pretty sour. It feels crappy to be there. But she operates there, and her learning velocity goes up 10 times. And it's this painful, intense spot to be, but the benefits are massive. And every talent hotbed I visited for the book, I would see that same pattern and that same painful moment. And it's kind of funny. A good way to think of it is to draw the connection to our physical world, to how we get in better shape, our muscles, right? We've known since aerobics was invented in the 70s, and that's when we realized no pain, no gain. Feel the burn. We reinterpreted that burn culturally as a positive thing. Before that burn was to be avoided. Like people who ran marathons were kind of thought of as nuts. But when we really started to connect, okay, wait a minute, there's huge physical benefits to spending short bits of time in this really uncomfortable place. That changed the culture of physical fitness. Well, that hasn't happened with cognitive fitness. That hasn't happened with skill yet. We still tend to interpret those intense moments of struggle as a negative, when in fact they are this huge positive. And by spending, just as Clarissa shows, a few minutes in that zone, in that sweet spot, you can massively change outcomes. You can massively change benefits. And when you sort of start to connect the dots, where are the Clarissa moments in education? Where are they in sports? You start to see the power of that moment, because our brain doesn't really care what it learns. Our brain learns according to the same principles. It doesn't know. Our brain doesn't know if it's learning piano or learning algebra. This is just how it's built to grow and adapt. And when we struggle, we send that brain a powerful signal. Okay, you need to grow in this area. This is going to be where we're going to have some compensation. And just to pick another example out of the education, since we were talking about that, like if there was a test tomorrow and we had a chapter to learn, would it be smarter? Here's a quiz. A, to read that chapter 4 times and highlight it 4 times in a row, read it over 4 times in a row. Or B, to read it once and then close the book, get a blank sheet of paper, and generate the main points of that.
Definitely the second.
Definitely the second. And it's not even a contest. It's like 100% more effective. It takes less time, actually, than to read it 4 times in a row. And when you regenerate, you're not going to get them all right. Like, you're going to struggle. You're gonna have trouble remembering the 3rd chapter heading or whatever. But that struggle will improve your grade on the test a lot. So once we kind of understand this, much like we've started to understood in the physical world, that when we go to a health club, we're not supposed to be lifting, half a pound. You should lift something that makes your muscles burn. Yeah. Once we sort of understand and take that idea into other domains, that's where you can sort of start to get a degree of control over the process, and control over the types of environments that you create for students or for business people or for anybody.
Yeah, that raises a lot of questions for me. One is why we see such a variation in levels of human performance. Like, why do we have the outliers of the world? When we kind of can say, okay, we've dissected human performance, we kind of understand what it takes, and yet the results vary across the board so drastically that it's just, to me, like I always use the analogy of a developing country for this. You have like the upper echelon, and then it seems like nobody in between, really.
Right. Well, it's interesting. I mean, in some ways that's very true. In some ways, it depends on what lens you look through. But the other reason, now that we understand how it works, it doesn't make it any easier.
Yeah.
To do that, to spend however 1,000 hours you want to spend in that sweet spot, which is really a hard place to be, requires certain levels of ignition, which, as we've already talked about, are hard to predict and kind of individualized. One way to sort of look at this question is to look at who the best singers in families are. It's a weird way to look at it, but if you look either at sort of sprinters, who's the fastest runner in a family, or who's the best singer in a family, like look at the Jacksons. Like, who's the best singer in the Jacksons?
Michael.
It's not Tito, right? It's
right.
Michael. Right? Who's the best singer in the Jonases? I don't even know who the Jonases are, but it's the youngest one, I think. And same with the Osmonds. If you look at runners, if you look at people who tend to steal bases in baseball, they're all younger. I did the fastest runners in the world, and they averaged 4 of 5 kids. There were not a firstborn in the bunch. Why is that? The firstborns had all the same genes. They had all the same opportunity, but what they didn't have was this wonderful environment of tons of models, and their windshield was packed with those sorts of things. So that creates a certain amount of just variation, right? Of incredible, variation because the environment is different. It doesn't mean you can't sort of re-engineer the environment to do that, but some of the variation is just built into the human experience.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think about the upbringing that my sister and I had, and both of us had very similar upbringings, but I mean drastically different lives in terms of what we chose to do, both career-wise and in terms of grades at school. I couldn't help but think when you said that, I'm like, I remember telling my sister, I'm like, this is what I screwed up freshman year at Berkeley. By the way, here's how you front load your entire freshman semester so you end up with like a super high GPA at the very beginning. And I was like, nobody was there to tell me that.
Yep. You're Michael, or she's Michael. Actually, she gets to learn from Tito, right? Yeah. It's true, and that opportunity, and other things like kids tend to go different directions to kind of occupy different niches in the environment. They're going to get, because if your sister goes one direction, you might go the other way, and and also the people around us are getting better. By the time Mozart came along, his father was a much better teacher because he had done all his teaching with his sister, right? Yeah. And his sister wasn't that great, but he used her to kind of figure it out. All right, now I'm gonna go to town, right? Same with Richard Williams and his kids. Same with Tiger Woods and his dad. Like, these patterns keep repeating, and they're not totally predictable, but they are super interesting and partially controllable.
I want to ask you a question, especially from your perspective, having done the work that you have, that I have asked a handful of people. The venture capitalist Chris Sacca says that when he invests in entrepreneurs, especially the ones that have had wild success, like the founders of Instagram, and he said this in damn near every interview I've ever heard him give, he says that every one of them believes that their success is inevitable. And the question that I have asked numerous people is whether that is something that is learned or that is just something naturally part of certain people.
Wow, that's a great question. I would say it's both. I would say to some degree some of these kind of emotional stability, sense of identity, big ego stuff is clearly driven by genes, partly by genes. But it's also created by A, sort of circumstance, and B, sort of the people and mentors around us. One of the more interesting sort of connections to that I can think of is the percentage of high achievers, especially in the political world, who are orphaned before specifically the age of 12. When you look at that list, it's stunning. It's absolutely stunning. And I forget the exact number, but it's like they're 1,300% more likely to be an orphan or something like that. If you're to be a president of the country or to be included in a list of eminent people. And it is, why is that? Like, why do they have that kind of, that strength of motivation, strength of character? And you could say because they got a signal pretty early on that the world is not a safe place. It's not a safe place. You're going to need to work really hard to get what you want, and you may need to develop a certain sense of inevitability in yourself. Another pattern in this area is kind of the mothers. The mothers, a lot of high achieving people were incredibly indulgent mothers, not necessarily the strictest, but people who put the kid in the apple of their eye and supported them and had unusually close bonds with them. And that sort of can create a sense of inevitability, a sense of that I can do this because I'm me. Period. Which if it gets out of which kind of in an appropriate environment can be incredibly productive. It can also be incredibly dysfunctional, as we've seen in the entrepreneurial world at times. Right? I mean, it's not really a bunch of super well balanced Boy Scouts who are out there making it happen. It's people who are kind of on the edge of what's acceptable.
Yeah, that actually poses another question. You were talking about the struggle and the ability to struggle and why we grow during struggles. And, I look at this, I asked a lot of people about the role that mental illness plays in all of these, like depression and anxiety, because to me, that seems like it's inevitably part of the struggle. But then there are certain people who come out of the struggle, and I'm wondering if the capacity to handle that struggle with resilience and with grit is something that is just a byproduct of the environments that you're put in. And, what are the patterns that you noticed when it comes to the struggle and the struggle on a much grander scale than struggling with just screwing up a measure in a piece of music. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I think it's true. I think it's a fascinating link, and there's a couple really good books. Madness and Genius, I think, is one of them that really attempts to create a model around that, and the link between that is unmistakable. And because this Bruce Springsteen's on my mind, he's had this huge history of sort of being quasi depressed a lot, and he's this guy who struggles with that. Have clearly informed his music and his greatness and his persistence at this. And it's easy to, I think maybe that word persistence might be a word that sort of links those two areas, because the people that end up sort of wrestling with something as profound as that every day end up sort of building pretty big emotional reserves for other sorts of wrestling matches, and you see it both on the mental side with somebody like Springsteen, or even Billy Joel has had a similar sort of arc. And you see it on the physical side. People who struggled with, physical problems like FDR, Wilma Rudolph, to pick an example from sports, where that struggle has had this sort of, multiple effect. It's sort of made them an outsider. It's made them incredibly persistent. It's put things in perspective. And it's sort of given them the opportunity to build on whatever grit they may have possessed in the beginning.
Do you think this is something that can be learned and developed later in life, or do you think that if we get to a certain age, we're just kind of beyond the point at which we could achieve mastery at this level? Because, when you look at 10,000 hours, and I think to myself, I'm like, wow, what a waste of time I had in high school, just screwing around doing nothing when I could have been practicing something for 10,000 hours.
Well, to pull the camera back for a second, I mean, when parents hear of 10,000 hours, the first thing they do is like send their kid to a factory of practice, right? Like that's the initial parental response, like, oh my God, you have to specialize, which is ironically like exactly the wrong thing to do. When you look across sort of high performers, a lot of them had a huge variety of stuff they did as a kid, and all that variety helps build a pyramid of connections, skill, a certain amount of fluidity to go between things, and this happens quite literally in athletes, where they look at the top performing athletes and they all have these very diverse backgrounds where they're sort of building a foundation on which they can layer on some sort of highly specialized stuff later on. But I think it also cuts across other domains as well. But to get back to your question of can you learn it later in life, or are we just kind of stuck? I mean, that was one of the more sort of encouraging areas that I had in talking to some of the scientists. All of them showed that a lot of these mechanisms still apply. It takes more reps. It takes a little more struggle. And clearly there are these, sort of golden development windows for language and for other things that, you're not going to take up the violin at 25 and play in a symphony orchestra. That's not going to happen. The developmental window is probably past in terms of your ear, in terms of your fine motor skills. But can you get really, really good? Yeah, you can. You can. It takes more reps. Mm-hmm. There's a great book by Gary Marcus called Guitar Zero, where he chronicles his attempts to become proficient at the guitar at age 45 or whatever it is, that sort of attacks sort of this. There's a guy trying to, he took up golf late and he's trying to make the PGA Tour. I think it's called the Dan Plan. He's also improving pretty astonishingly. Are either of these guys going to make it to the very, very top of their profession? No, probably not. Are they going to be really, really good? Are they going to be? Is he going to be a scratch golfer, and is Gary Marcus going to be able to rip a solo to impress the hell out of his family at a family reunion? Yes. So it kind of depends on what your map, what your goal is, and I think for most of us, and where we're mostly on the zone of like, I need to get really good. I don't need to become world class, but I'd really like to be really good at this, and that is still possible at a relatively advanced stage.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear you say that, because I'm an avid surfer, and I think about people like Laird Hamilton and some of the guys who surf bonsai pipeline, and my buddy Brian and I look at that, we're like, yeah, we're never going to do that shit. That would be a suicide mission for us. Right. But you kind of realize, you're like, okay, wait a minute, Laird has been in the water since he was 4 years old.
That's right. That's right. You're not going to catch that.
Yeah.
But you can get really good. You'd probably surprise yourself. That's really, and you definitely would surprise yourself if you devoted yourself to it.
So that raises the question of how do you take all of this and make it much more tangible to immediately begin impacting our lives? I mean, I think about it from the lens of interviewing as my craft. And, after 700 of these, I realize I've probably done a lot of what you've said without consciously being aware of it.
Yep. Well, so the question becomes, let's just turn this on you a little bit and say, what could you have done from the interview number one to make the most of each learning experience? And I would say, I'd be curious to hear your answer to that. But if I were to take this model and sort of put it on there, I think it would come down to you would have intently studied the best people you could find. And by studying, I mean, literally trying to emulate them and writing down different techniques and methods that they use. And then you would have, after each interview, you would have tried to measure the distance between you and them through reflection and see, honestly, what did I do well? Honestly, where did I fall short? After each rep, almost like you're in a skateboard park and they do a trick and you try that same trick and you say, you look at the videotape and you say, where did I hit it and where did I miss it? Yeah. And you do that you loop that every single time you do an interview. And is it tedious? Is it repetitive? Totally. It is. But you know what? Repetition and tedium has a bad reputation in our society. Repetition is pretty powerful, especially when, in this case, it wouldn't actually be repetition. You'd be doing something slightly different each time. And it'd be easy to become absorbed and to improve. You're an incredible interviewer. And clearly you've taken a lot of these lessons to heart, and clearly you reflect on this a lot. So is it possible that you could have improved even faster? I'd say maybe it would be possible.
Yeah. It's always been interesting to look at kind of, the one thing I wish I could do is find a way to get a brain scan of when we started running the show and what it's like after. I've always been curious as to what it must look like after all these conversations. Well, it's interesting. I mean, I asked that question to this guy, Dr. Douglas Fields, that I visited for my book, and he showed me this picture of myelin. Mm. We probably remember myelin from a myelin sheath in our biology class, myelin, and it looks like he showed me a cross section of a neuron, and myelin is the stuff that's wrapping it like electrical tape, and its function is it exists because it's an insulation. The same reason we wrap the cords of the computer we're talking on to stop that signal from leaking out. And Dr. Fields started to explain to me, when you do a lot of intensive reps, when you operate in kind of what I would call deep practice, you actually grow thicker and thicker layers of myelin on the circuitry on which you're practicing. I mean, they have done scans, actually, of people after 200 hours of piano practice and 500 hours of piano practice. And the myelin growth in those areas of the brain is proportional to the time they spend practicing. So every hour you did your intensive interviewing and you're learning and you're struggling, you would have been adding layers of myelin to that circuitry of your brain, which makes it run faster and better. And as Dr. Fields explained, that myelin is like broadband. It's like you're building broadband through struggle, and by falling short and by reaching again. So you're reaching, failing, reaching, and each time you earn a little bit more and a little thicker layer, and the signal speed goes up. That's just sort of some basic electrical engineering. The thicker the layer, the faster the signal. And the difference isn't small. When there's no myelin, the signal goes 2 miles an hour. When there's 50 layers of myelin, it goes 200 miles an hour. So you're going from goat paths in your brain to like bullet train. And that's why you're better and faster, because if we were to scan your brain, we'd find a lot more of that along the pathways you're using right now. Wow, that's really interesting. It makes me even think of the writing practice that I have of writing 1,000 words a day. I figured, I'm like, okay, that's got to be doing something too. Huge, right? I mean, the nice thing about the model, I think, is that you're sort of earning it, and it gives repetition. And I think Aristotle said, we are what we repeatedly do. Excellence is not an act, but a habit. And that's extremely powerful. I mean, he didn't know about myelin or about sort of the neurology of learning, but that's exactly what he's talking about. You are what you repeatedly do. Not what you do once or twice, but what you repeatedly do. Well, this has been really cool. really kind of an eye-opening look into talent. And I love the fact that it wasn't entirely prescriptive, but more story-based, which was different than I expected it would be. So I have one final question for you, which is how we finish all our interviews.
Cool.
What do you think it is that makes somebody or something unmistakable?
Wow. Unmistakable. I think it's the way they think. I think you can, it's possible in this day and age to kind of replicate a lot of things about a person or something they bring. But the way they tackle a problem tends to be what I find memorable and valuable about somebody. Because you think about a problem, I often find myself thinking, man, what would so-and-so think? How would they react to this? And I think that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for that lens, that unique problem-solving lens that they can put on it. And to me, that's the most kind of, valuable asset that anybody can bring to any relationship.
Awesome. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to join us and share your story and your insights with our listeners. I think they're going to really enjoy this.
My pleasure. It's been a blast. And let me know if I can ever help again.
Awesome. And for everybody listening, we will wrap the show with that. Next week on the Unmistakable Creative.
Yeah, of course. There's a great body of research on this that Robert Eisenberger spearheaded more than 2 decades ago on what's called learned industriousness, which is literally like the acquired capacity for self-discipline and willpower. We know now that a lot of discipline seems to be like a muscle where you work it initially and then it tears, but then it builds itself up. And I think a lot of learning discipline is starting by experiencing flow and getting so fascinated by something that you fall into this, like I'm in the zone moment where you lose track of time, you don't notice your surroundings, and pretty soon hours have gone by. And for me, I guess learning discipline was a lot of saying, I need to get good enough that I can get into flow in this task.
Wharton professor and author Adam Grant joins us to talk about his new book, Originals: How Nonconformists Move the World.